It's that time of the week again when I attempt to predict the outcomes of the upcoming Premier League games. I did very badly last week with only 2 correct predictions and 8 incorrect, but at this stage I'm not going to win my predictions league anyway. Here's a look at how the top 5 in that league stands. Just a note for fantasy managers to remind them 8 teams play twice this week and their players are at a premium. All of those teams don't play next week though, with the exception of Burnley, and the trick is to strike a balance in your team. Those who have played their chips in the best possible way will look to gain a real advantage over the last 5 weeks of the season. Saturday, April 14th, Southampton v Chelsea, 12:30 p.m. British Summer Time, St. Mary's Stadium, Southampton. Southampton led at Arsenal last week, but they ended up losing 3-2 and they're still in the bottom 3 with games running out. Only West Brom have taken less points at home than Southampton, and they haven't won in their last 8 home games. They have only won once in 19 games and no other team has drawn more games. With Charlie Austin back from his latest injury and Southampton playing twice this week, he might just be a player to interest fantasy managers. Chelsea led at home to West Ham last week, but they had to settle for a point as they lost even more ground on the top 4. They have lost their last 3 away games, but only City have conceded less goals away from home. They've only won twice in their last 8 games and they have scored less goals than the rest of the top 6. Chelsea are one of the 8 teams playing twice this week and their players have to be seriously considered by fantasy managers, but they are struggling badly at the moment. Southampton need to get some points from their 2 games this week before their FA Cup semi-final, which is also against Chelsea, but I think Chelsea will just about take the 3 points in this game. Prediction, 1-2 Burnley v Leicester City, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, Turf Moor. Burnley won 2-1 away to Watford last week to stay 5 points behind 6th-placed Arsenal with 6 games to play. They have only won 6 of their 15 home games and no other team has scored less goals at home. They have won their last 4 games, but they are the lowest scorers in the top half of the table. With 2 games this week and a game next week, Burnley players are at a premium for fantasy managers, with Ashley Barnes, Chris Wood and their defenders and keeper all worth considering. Leicester lost 2-1 at home to Newcastle last week and it now looks like 8th place will be the best they can do. They won their last 2 away games and scored 6 goals in those games, and only the top 4 have scored more away goals. Their defeat last week was only their 3rd defeat in 11 games and they haven't failed to score in their last 9 games. Both Riyad Mahrez and Jamie Vardy are very good options for fantasy managers with 2 games this week, but it has to be remembered they don't play next week. Both teams need to win this game in their quest to secure a Europa League place for next season, and I think we will probably see the spoils shared. Prediction, 1-1 Crystal Palace v Brighton and Hove Albion, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, Selhurst Park, London. Palace led twice at Bournemouth last week, but they had to settle for a point in the end and they're only 3 points above the bottom 3. Only West Brom and Southampton have taken less points at home and they have only won once in their last 7 home games. They have only won once in their last 10 games and they only kept 1 clean sheet in those 10 games. Luka Milivojevic and Wilfried Zaha are the 2 Palace players who could make a difference for fantasy managers. Brighton led at home to Huddersfield last week, but they had to settle for a draw in the end too. They haven't won in their last 9 away games and they failed to score in 7 of those games, with only Stoke and West Brom taking less points on the road and no other team scoring less away goals. They haven't won in 3 games, but they were unbeaten in the previous 5 and 1 more win will probably be enough to keep them up, but they have to play all of the top 4 in their last 6 games. With 2 games this week, Brighton players could be on fantasy managers' radars, with PASCSL Gross probably the most likely to perform. I think Palace will get the win they so desperately need in their attempt to stay clear of the bottom 3. Prediction, 2-0 Huddersfield Town v Watford, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, John Smith Stadium, Huddersfield. Huddersfield came from behind to get a 1-1 draw away to Brighton last week and that point moved them 4 points above the relegation zone. They have only won once in their last 8 home games and they failed to score in half of those games, with only Burnley scoring less goals at home. They have only won twice in their last 15 games, with no other team scoring less goals and only 3 teams conceding more. I can't see any Huddersfield players to recommend to fantasy managers. Watford lost 2-1 at home to Palace last week, but the 9 points they have to spare over the bottom 3 should be more than enough to keep them up. They have only taken 1 point in their last 9 away games and they have failed to score in their last 5 on the road. They have only taken 1 point in their last 4 games, with only Stoke conceding more goals. Like Huddersfield, I can't see any Watford players to recommend to fantasy managers, although I do think Will Hughes might have something to offer. Huddersfield badly need a win in this game in their fight to avoid relegation, but I think they will have to settle for a point. Prediction, 1-1 Swansea City v Everton, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, Liberty Stadium. Swansea came from behind to get a 1-1 draw at West Brom last week and they're now 4 points above the drop zone. They have won their last 4 home games and scored 9 goals in the process, but only Burnley have scored less goals at home. They have only lost twice in their last 10 games, but no other team has scored less goals. There's every chance of Swansea keeping a clean sheet in this game, and Łukasz Fabianski is the most likely player to benefit fantasy managers if they do. Everton drew 0-0 at home to a Liverpool with bigger things on their minds last week, and they still hold out hope of catching Leicester to finish 8th. They won their last away game after losing the previous 5, with only West Ham and Stoke conceding more away goals. They have been very inconsistent this season, and that's mainly down to their poor away record and a defense which has seen only 4 other teams concede more goals. Sanctosin is the Everton player most likely to score points for fantasy managers. I can't see too many goals in this game, but I think Swansea might just get the better of proceedings. Prediction, 1-0 Liverpool v Bournemouth, 5:30 p.m. British Summer Time, Anfield. Liverpool drew 0-0 at Everton last week as they rested players for their Champions League game against City. They're the only team still unbeaten at home, while only United and Spurs have conceded less goals at home, but only the bottom 2 have drawn more home games. Only City have lost less games and scored more goals, but their minds could be elsewhere with their top 4 place almost certain and a Champions League semi-final coming up. With Mohamed Salah back from injury, he's by far the best choice in the Liverpool team for fantasy managers, while both Sadio Mane and Roberto Firmino are pretty good bets too. Bournemouth twice came from behind to get a draw at home to Palace last week, and their Premier League status has to be secure for another season. They have only lost once in their last 6 away games, but they did draw 4 of those games. They have only lost twice in their last 14 games and they scored in each of those games, but only 4 teams have conceded more goals. If he's fit to play, I think Junior Stanislas is probably the Bournemouth player most likely to do well for fantasy managers in their 2 games this week. I think Liverpool should win with a couple of goals at least to spare as they continue to chase second place before their Champions League semi-final. Prediction, 3-1 Tottenham Hotspur v Manchester City, 7:45 p.m. British Summer Time, Wembley Stadium, London. Spurs just about managed to win 2-1 at Stoke last week and they're only behind third-placed Liverpool on goal difference with a goal in hand. They are unbeaten at home since losing their first home game of the season, and only United have conceded less home goals. They have won their last 6 games and scored 13 goals in the process, with only the top 2 conceding less goals. With an extra game this week, Harry Kane is at a premium for fantasy managers, while Christian Eriksen, Dele Alli, Heung-min Son and their defenders and keeper are all worth considering too, even if this isn't the easiest match to start the week off. City led 2-0 at home to United last week and looked to have the title sewn up, but they somehow managed to lose 3-2 and they followed it up by going out of the Champions League in midweek. No other team has taken more points or scored more goals on the road, and they have only lost 1 away game so far. Before losing to United, they had taken 22 points from their previous 8 games and scored 21 goals in those games, with a host of Premier League records still available for them to set. Despite the defeat to United last week, players like Leroy Sane, Raheem Sterling, David Silva, Sergio Aguero and Kevin De Bruyne are all very good buys for fantasy managers, and particularly now that they only have Premier League games left to play. I think this will be a very close game, and I have a feeling City will lose their 4th game in a row in all competitions. Prediction, 2-1 Sunday, April 15th, Newcastle United v Arsenal, 1:30 p.m. British Summer Time, St. James's Park, Newcastle. Newcastle won 2-1 away to Leicester last week to move 10 points above the bottom 3 and virtually assure their Premier League survival. They have won their last 3 home games without conceding a goal, and they are unbeaten in 6 games on their own patch. They have won their last 3 games and only lost 2 of their last 12, with only 6 teams conceding less goals. Kennedy still looks like the Newcastle player most likely to gain some points for fantasy managers. Arsenal came back from 1-0 down to win 3-2 at home to Southampton last week, and they're only 3 points behind 5th-placed Chelsea. They have only won 3 of their 15 away games and they have lost their last 4 on the road. They have won 5 and lost 5 of their last 10 games, and they have conceded a lot more goals than the rest of the top 6. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang is almost certain to start all of Arsenal's Premier League games as they rest others for Europa League action, and he has done really well for fantasy managers since joining them in January. Newcastle will make things very difficult for an Arsenal team who have struggled away from home, but I think Arsenal will just edge it. Prediction: 1-2 Manchester United v West Bromwich Albion 4 p.m. British Summer Time, Old Trafford. Manchester United came from 2-0 down to win 3-2 at City last week, and that win strengthened their grip on second place. Only City have taken more points at home, and no other team has conceded less goals at home, while they have won their last 5 home games and kept clean sheets in 4 of the last 6. They've won their last 5 games and 9 of their last 11, with only City conceding less goals. With 2 games against teams who concede a lot of goals this week, Romelu Lukaku, Alexis Sanchez, and United's defenders and keeper all look like very good choices for fantasy managers. West Brom led at home to Swansea last week, but they had to settle for a point and their 10 points from safety with 5 games left, with relegation a certainty at this stage. They haven't won in their last 15 away games, with only Brighton scoring less goals away from home. They have only won once in their last 31 games, but at least their draw last week put an end to a run of 8 consecutive defeats. I can't see any West Brom players to recommend to fantasy managers despite Solomon Rondon being in good form at the moment. I can't see anything other than a comprehensive United victory in this game. Prediction: 3-0 Monday, April 16th West Ham United v Stoke City 8 p.m. British Summer Time, London Stadium, London. West Ham got a very good point at Chelsea last week to move 6 points clear of the bottom 3. They have taken 11 points from their last 6 home games, and another 3 points in this game could be enough to keep them up. They have only won twice in their last 9 games, with only Stoke conceding more goals. Marco Arnautovic is the West Ham player to have for fantasy managers at the moment. Stoke lost 2-1 at home to Spurs last week, and they're now 4 points adrift of 17th place with only 5 games left to play. They haven't won in their last 11 away games, and only West Ham have conceded more goals away from home. They haven't won in 9 games, and they failed to score in 4 of those games, with no other team conceding more goals. If Stoke are to have any chance of avoiding the drop, then Xherdan Shaqiri is the man who will get the goals for them and the points for fantasy managers. This is a huge game for both teams, and I think West Ham will take the 3 points, which will probably condemn Stoke to relegation. Prediction: 2-0 Tuesday, April 17th Brighton and Hove Albion v Tottenham Hotspur 7:45 p.m. British Summer Time, Amex Stadium, Brighton. Brighton play for the second time this week, and a win in either game would surely be enough to see them avoid the drop. Only 7 teams have taken more home points than Brighton, and they have taken 10 points from their last 5 home games. Despite having 2 games this week, Brighton players will do well to make a difference for fantasy managers when you see the games they are playing. Spurs play their second game of the week too, and they will find Brighton an easier opponent than City. They have won their last 4 away games and are unbeaten in 8 on the road, with only City taking more points on their travels. As I said previously, Harry Kane could be an excellent choice for fantasy managers as he looks to catch Mohamed Salah in the race for the Golden Boot. I think Spurs will continue their impressive run by taking all 3 points in this game. Prediction: 0-2 Wednesday, April 18th Bournemouth v Manchester United 7:45 p.m. British Summer Time, Vitality Stadium, Bournemouth. Bournemouth play their second tough game of the week, and they will do well to get anything from United or Liverpool. They have only lost once in their last 8 home games, and they scored 16 goals in those 8 games. Bournemouth might have 2 games this week, but it's difficult for fantasy managers to select their players when those games are against Liverpool and United. United play for the second time this week, and they have the chance to close the gap at the top of the table, even if they're not going to catch City, but more importantly, they can move further ahead of the teams chasing them for second place. They have won their last 2 away games, and they scored 6 goals in those 2 games, but it's the points they have dropped away from home which have seen them miss out on a real title challenge. United's players should be looking to get plenty of goals in the 2 games they have this week, and they are very attractive to fantasy managers. I think United should win this game with a couple of goals to spare. Prediction: 1-3 Thursday, April 19th Burnley v Chelsea 7:45 p.m. British Summer Time, Turf Moor, Burnley. Burnley play their second home game of the week, and they have the chance to close in on 6th place if they can do well in one or both of these games. Despite the relatively few goals they have conceded, Burnley haven't kept too many clean sheets in recent weeks, and the 2 games they have could make it difficult for their attacking players to make an impact for fantasy managers. Chelsea play their second away game of the week and they could be tempted to rest players ahead of their FA Cup semi-final as fourth place now looks beyond them. The indecision over the team Chelsea will select makes it difficult to recommend their players to fantasy managers this week even with 2 games. With that FA Cup game on their minds, Chelsea might struggle in this game and I wouldn't be surprised to see it end all square. Prediction, 1-1 Leicester City v Southampton 7:45 p.m. British Summer Time, King Power Stadium, Leicester play for the second time in a week and any hope they have of making the Europa League places depends on them winning both games. They haven't won in 4 home games and they have only taken 3 points more at home than they have on their travels. Jamie Vardy and Riyad Mahrez are difficult to ignore for fantasy managers this week when you consider the opposition in their 2 games. Southampton play for the second time this week, but they can't afford to rest any players ahead of their FA Cup semi-final with the relegation dogfight their number 1 priority. They have only won 2 of their 16 away games and they conceded 9 goals in losing their last 3 away games. As I said already, Charlie Austin is a possibility for fantasy managers this week, but he is incredibly injury-prone too. I think this will be a close game, but Southampton's woes will continue with yet another defeat. Prediction, 2-1 That's it for this week.